Caleb Morse was 14 years old when his father died. He was left with one farm, one broken tractor, one mother, and $200 in a coffee can. Caleb took that money to the John Deere dealer. Gerald Fitch looked at it, then looked at him and said, "Your daddy's gone, son. Go home." Caleb put the money back in his pocket. He walked out, drove home, and told his mother what happened. Dorothy Morse looked at her 14-year-old son and said 4 words that changed everything. "Then we fix it ourselves." 30 years later, Caleb Morse walked back into that dealership. Not for parts, not for a tractor. He walked in with his attorney and a purchase agreement. He was there to buy the building. My name is Caleb Morse. I want to tell you something that started with a broken tractor and $200 and ended 30 years later in the same building where a man told me to go home. Everything in between is what this story is about. My father, Robert Morse, farmed 180 acres in Callaway County his whole life. He died of a heart attack in June 1994. I was 14. My sister was 11. My mother had never managed a farm account in her life. We had one working tractor, a 1978 John Deere 4040, and it had thrown a rod the week before Dad died. The farm ran on that tractor. Without it, we couldn't plant. Without planting, we had no income. Without income, we would lose the farm to the bank by spring. I understood that at 14, so I counted every dollar in the house. $217. Then I drove to Fitch's John Deere. Gerald Fitch had run Fitch John Deere for 22 years. He knew my father, had sold him 2 tractors. I told him what happened, told him about the rod, asked what $200 could do toward a repair. He looked at the money on the counter, then at me and said, "Son, that won't even cover the diagnostic. Go home." Here's something most people outside farming don't understand. The USDA Farm Service Agency has offered emergency loan programs since 1949 for families facing sudden hardship. Rates can be as low as 3.75% annually. Gerald Fitch knew about that program. He never mentioned it to a 14-year-old boy with $200. I drove home and told Mom what Fitch said. She sat very still for a moment, then said, "Then we fix it ourselves." Neither of us knew how. But Pete Callaway, who farmed the land next to ours, had been watching our lights on late every night that week. The next morning, he knocked on our door. Pete Callaway was 64. He had fixed more John Deere engines than he could count. He looked at the 4040 for 40 minutes, then came inside, sat at our table and said, "Dorothy, the rod is rebuildable. I need 3 weeks and the boys' help." He never once asked what we would pay him. He just started the next morning. Pete and I worked on that engine every day for 21 days. He taught me how to pull a rod bearing, how to measure crank journal clearance, how to torque a rebuilt assembly. I was 14, learning things most mechanics don't know at 40. Pete told me, "Caleb, a man who knows his equipment never needs to beg for it." What Pete taught me had real agricultural value. USDA data shows that farm operators who handle their own equipment maintenance can reduce annual operating costs by an average of 31%. That kind of knowledge, passed from neighbor to neighbor, is one of the oldest forms of sustainability in farming. Pete Callaway gave me 30 years of it in 3 weeks. The 4040 fired on day 22. First start. Clean idle. Pete stepped back, crossed his arms and said nothing for a full minute. Then he looked at me and said, "Your daddy would have liked that sound." I couldn't answer him, but I remember exactly what that engine sounded like. We planted that spring. Me, Mom, and Pete driving the 4040 when I was in school. The crop came in, not perfect, but enough. Enough to make the first loan payment. Enough to buy seed for the next year. Enough to stay. Over the next 4 years, I ran the farm after school and on weekends. Mom handled the books. Pete helped whenever I needed him. I learned to weld at 16, rebuilt our second tractor at 17. At 18, I applied for and received a USDA beginning farmer loan, the first loan I ever took and the first one in my name. Pete Calloway passed away in 2003. He left me his toolbox in his will, every tool labeled in his handwriting. I still use them, every single one. Some of the labels are worn now, but I know what each tool is. He made sure I would. By 2024, I farmed 340 acres in Callaway County, owned outright. No mortgage, 3 employees, 2 modern tractors, 1 rebuilt 1978 John Deere 4040, still running. I had not set foot in Fitch John Deere in 30 years. Then I heard Gerald Fitch was selling the dealership, and I made a phone call. Purchasing an agricultural equipment dealership involves specific federal licensing under the Equipment Dealers Act. A buyer must demonstrate financial stability, operational knowledge, and manufacturer relationship capacity. I had farmed for 30 years and maintained equipment professionally. John Deere Corporate reviewed my application and approved it in 19 days. My attorney and I walked into Fitch John Deere on a Tuesday morning. Gerald was behind the counter, the same counter. He didn't recognize me at first. My attorney placed the purchase agreement on the counter. Gerald looked at it, then at me, and said, "Caleb Morse?" I said, "Yes, sir. I believe you know my name." Gerald Fitch sat down slowly and read the purchase agreement twice. The offer was fair, above market value. My attorney made sure of that. Gerald looked up at me once while reading. I didn't look away. Neither did he. He signed on page 7. Here is what that moment taught me, and I want every young person watching to hear this. The USDA Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program exists for people who start with nothing. It offers grants, low-interest loans, and training programs. If I had known at 14 what I know now, that $200 might have gone much further. Know your resources. I kept every employee Gerald had, every single one. Good people doing honest work had nothing to do with what their previous employer said to a 14-year-old boy. On the first day, I told them this dealership will never turn away a farm family, because their money isn't enough. We find another way, every time. Gerald Fitch retired to Florida. We have not spoken since the closing. I don't carry anger about what he said in 1994. Anger is expensive, and I have a dealership to run. But I think about that boy with $200 sometimes standing at that counter. I think he did all right. The 1978 John Deere 4040 still runs, parked in my barn, where Pete and I rebuilt it in 1994. I started every spring. First start of planting season, every year, without exception. Some things you don't retire. Some things you just keep running, because the man who taught you how deserves that much.